We're going to pick up where we left off last week, actually 2 weeks ago. So turn in your Bible to the book of Genesis chapter 30, and let's read verses 25 and 26. Soon after Rachel had given birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, "Please release me so I can go home to my own country. Let me take my wives and children, for I have earned them by serving you, and let me be on my way. You certainly know how hard I have worked for you." Now, it kind of sounds like Jacob is asking for permission, but again, you have to understand the culture and the customs. So let me just kind of go through this and hopefully bring you a little bit more insight. Shortly after Joseph was born, Jacob went to Laban and he informed him that I'm leaving and that he was going to take his family with him. And of course, he reminded Laban how he had lived up to his part of the bargain. So Laban had no moral or legal right to keep him from leaving his family. And the whole reason that Jacob went to Laban to tell him he was leaving is because it was the right way to leave. No matter how bad Laban had treated him, Jacob was still going to do the right thing. And the right thing was to be upfront with Laban and inform him of his intentions. I fulfilled my obligation. I fulfilled my duty. Me and my family, we're going to be leaving. Now, what's interesting about this is that this is a great lesson for us, and I'll tell you why it is. Sometimes we're tempted whenever we've been in a bad job or maybe we've had a bad boss to quit and to quit the wrong way. Oh, I'm just going to walk out. I'm just going to storm out. I'm not going to give them 2 weeks' notice. And then when they get out, I'm going to trash the company. I'm going to tell everyone about that person, my boss, or this company. But you know what? Jacob didn't do that. If anyone had a right to be bitter, if anyone had ever been dealt treacherously with, it was Jacob. But the interesting thing about Jacob is Jacob left the right way. And no matter what had happened to him, he still did the right thing. Now, let me tell you, if you're a Christian, God expects you to do the right thing. Now, there are times you might work for a company, you give them 2 weeks' notice, and they say, well, you just pack up your things and you leave right now. Well, you leave nicely. And let me just tell you, when you actually make out your letter, your written notice of resignation or whatever you're going to do, make sure it's nice. I have never understood Christians who will just let go and verbally vomit all over their boss. And I'll be honest with you, probably your boss is not a Christian, and the company is not a Christian organization. And I know people do it all the time that are supposedly Christians because it's happened to me with people who's worked for me before here at the church. And I'll be honest with you, I have never, ever treated a person wrong in the capacity of them working for me and staff. But you probably heard things that I have, and I've never got up and defended myself. I've always had a right to let them go, and I always bent over backwards to make sure that I treated them the way that I would want to be treated. And I'm always surprised at how people will leave as Christians and not take responsibility for their own action. But here's the most interesting thing. Here Jacob is, and if anyone has a right to be bitter, if anyone has a right to be mad, if anyone had a right to just kind of slough off and go through the motions and just fulfill his time, it was Jacob, but he didn't do that. And God blessed him for that. But there's another reason that Jacob went to his father-in-law to inform him that he was leaving. And that was because he hoped that Laban would reciprocate in kind and would also do the right thing. You see, Jacob's position was that of an indentured servant. How many of you know what an indentured servant is? An indentured servant was someone who agreed to work for another person for a set period of time in exchange for something. In fact, when America was being settled, many Europeans would actually sell themselves as indentured servants in order to get over to America. And that's how they paid for their passage. They became indentured servants. They would work for 3 years or maybe 7 years. And there were set terms in this contract that I will do this for you if you pay for my passage over here. Well, that's basically what an indentured servant is. It's someone who agrees to work for another person for a set period of time in exchange for something. So Jacob, in every definition of the term, was an indentured servant to Laban. He had agreed to work for Laban for 7 years in exchange for the right to marry Rachel. Now we understand and know by reading the story that Laban tricked him. He dealt treacherously with him, and Jacob had to work 14 years in order to pay off his debt to Laban for the right to marry Rachel, which really wasn't right, but he'd been tricked into it. Now, it was customary at that time that after an indentured servant fulfilled his terms of service, that you didn't send him away empty-handed. Look with me, if you would, in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 13 through 14. Notice what it says. When you release an indentured servant, do not send him away empty-handed. Give him a generous farewell gift from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. Share with him some of the bounty with which the Lord your God has blessed you. Now, I want you to notice something. I want you to notice that he didn't say, share from one of the three. Did he say that? No. He said, what I want you to do is I want you to share some of your things from your flock, from your threshing floor, and your winepress. You be generous with those who have come in and they've worked for you. Now, of course, this is part of the Mosaic Law, and this is after the time period that we're dealing with, but we know that it was the custom of the day because of the Nuzi tablets. How many of you are familiar with the Nuzi tablets? The Nuzi tablets were clay tablets that were found in Iraq somewhere actually before 1900, but they really did some excavations. Americans did from the time of about 1923 to 1933. And they found, I can't tell you, bukus of clay tablets. And on these clay tablets were the laws and customs of the time. And they're from a people that's mentioned in the Bible, the Horites. And so what's interesting is we know because of those clay tablets, because they date back actually a little bit before this time period and during this time period. So we know based upon those clay tablets what the customs of those times were, and the custom was exactly what the Mosaic Law said. If you had an indentured servant, someone who had come in and agreed to work for you for a specific amount of time in exchange for something, when they fulfilled their terms of service, you weren't supposed to let them go empty-handed, because now they're going out with nothing. So what are they going to do? Well, now they're going to have to go in and get in debt again. So what you were supposed to do is to help them make a start. So what Jacob is expecting is he's expecting to come to his father-in-law and for his father-in-law to do the right thing and not send him away empty-handed, especially since he had married his daughters and produced grandchildren. If he's not going to do it for his nephew, hopefully he'll do it for his daughters and his grandchildren. But you need to understand, Laban's a very greedy and selfish man, and he wasn't going to give Jacob anything. He wasn't going to give his daughters anything or his grandchildren. You see, Laban only abided by the customs of the time when it served his purposes. When it didn't serve his purposes, he ignored them. But he didn't want to lose Jacob. Why? Because Jacob was a man of integrity. He was a rare person. You could mistreat him and he still did his job. You could be bad to him and he still showed up for work on time, and he worked when you weren't looking. He was the type of person that took care of your things the way he would want his things taken care of, and he was a tremendous worker. So Laban did not want to get rid of him. So here's what Laban did. He disregarded what Jacob had said, and he politely requested that he stay. And then he proposed that they negotiate some type of deal that would keep him working for him. Look at verses 27 and 28. And Laban said to him, please stay if I have found favor in your eyes, for I have learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake. Then he said, name your wages and I will pay it. Now, from Laban's perspective, Jacob was a man of integrity and a hard worker, but he was a poor businessman. And he was confident that he could negotiate a deal that worked to his benefit. He was confident that he could skin him alive like he did the first time. Because he thought like, and no disrespect intended, but he thought like a lawyer. We can put some fine print in here, and I can operate according to the fine print, and I can take you. Now, The reason he was able to get Jacob the first time is because Jacob trusted him and Jacob was naive. But now, Jacob understands just how unscrupulous Laban was. I can't say is, he's no longer alive, but how unscrupulous Laban was, and he wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. In fact, here's what's interesting. Jacob ends up skinning Laban. He's going to turn the tables on him. Now, here's what's interesting. He's not going to do it through trickery. He's not going to do it through deceit. He's going to do it through his own intellect, through his experience, through wisdom, and of course, through God. Now, in the beginning, it's going to look like, oh no, poor Jacob, Laban did it again. But what we're going to find out is Jacob's a very, very intelligent person. And he's not the person that he's been made out to be by other pastors, and I have to say, even by myself when I was younger, because I taught the very same thing that I heard, that Jacob was this dirty, sneaky thief. You had to watch him because he would really get one over on you, and then he got his due when he got a father-in-law like Laban because they were just alike. And people, that's not true. When you truly understand the story and you understand the Hebrew and you're able to read what it's really saying, Jacob was a man of integrity. Jacob was a man who wanted to do the right thing. At times, he didn't stand up for the right thing, especially when he should have stood up to his mother. But he was a man of integrity. And so he's going to end up skinning Laban, but it's not going to be through trickery. It's not going to be through deceit. It's going to be through his intellect. So the negotiations began. But before Jacob told Laban what he wanted, he explained why he deserved what he was going to ask for. And that's just good negotiations. You know, if you're going to negotiate with someone, you've got to tell them what you can do for them, right? Why it's to their advantage to hire you and pay you this much. Something would be wrong if you went in and you said, whoa, you want to pay me that much? I'm not worth it. No. You don't do that. If you want to negotiate right, you've got to tell what you can do for them and why it's going to be to their advantage to hire you and pay you this much. And so what Jacob's going to do is he's going to explain to his father-in-law why he deserved what he was going to ask for. Look at verses 29 and 30. Jacob said to him, you know how I have worked for you and how your livestock has fared under my care. The little you had before I came has increased greatly. And the Lord has blessed you wherever I have been. But now, when may I do something for my own household? So basically, Jacob gave Laban two reasons why he deserved what he was going to ask for. And why, if he didn't get it, he couldn't and he wouldn't stay. And the reasons he gave were legitimate. The first reason is that he had made Laban a rich man. When he came, Laban had little. He didn't have an abundance. He was not a rich man. In fact, he actually couldn't even hire people to look after all of his flocks, so he had his daughter out doing that. That was not women's work. Do you remember that? But why did he do that? Because he couldn't hire a male servant. So when Jacob finally gets to Haran and he meets his uncle, he realized, you had little. But under Jacob's care, that little that Laban had increased greatly. And in 14 short years, Laban had become a very wealthy man. So that's the first reason he's worthy of what he's going to ask for. The second reason he's going to ask for it is because Jacob had a family he needed to take care of. So he had to think of them first. So what he's actually telling his father-in-law is, if I don't get what I want, then I need to take my family and I need to head home because I come from a wealthy family. I don't need this. And it was as simple as that. Now, Laban couldn't argue with him, so once more he told Jacob to name his wages, but he didn't say it like that. Look at verse 31. What shall I give you? He asked. Don't give me anything, Jacob replied. But if you will do this one thing for me, I will go on tending your flocks and watching over them. Now, if you're honest, you can see the animosity in Jacob's response. It's there. Because when Laban asked him, what shall I give you? Actually, the response is more like, there's not a thing you can give me. That's actually more of a literal translation. There's not one stinking thing you can give me. Emphasis on give. So basically what Jacob was saying is that you're not going to give me anything. And I'm not going to ask you for anything. I just want the opportunity. I just want the chance to build my own livestock so I can take care of my family. So all I want is the opportunity to build my own livestock as I care for your livestock. And that's what I want. Now, here's what's interesting. Even in the Bible, going all the way back there, that's the right Christian response. Let me just tell you, when it comes to politics, wealth redistribution is not biblical at all. What makes America great is that we promise the opportunity for you to prosper. But it's up to you to do it. And so Jacob's response is, and there's an animosity in it, there's not a stinking thing you can give me. I'm not asking for you to give me anything. All I'm asking is the opportunity for me to build my own livestock as I take care of yours. That's what I want. Look at verses 32 and 33. And this is where he tells Laban how he wants to do that. This is the opportunity he needs. Let me inspect your flocks today and remove all the sheep and goats that are speckled or spotted, along with all the black sheep. Give these to me as my wages. In the future, when you check on the animals you have given me as my wages, you'll see that I've been honest. If you find in my flock any goats without speckles or spots or any sheep that are not black, you will know that I have stolen them from you. So there's two things that Jacob wants in exchange for taking care of Laban's livestock. First of all, he wants to inspect Laban's flocks and to remove any of the goats that are speckled or spotted and any of the sheep that are black. And he wanted Laban to give those goats and sheep to him as part of his wages. It's something that he should have done anyway as part of the custom. He has fulfilled his service as an indentured, or the terms of his service as an indentured servant. So really, Laban should have done something like this anyway. So what he's saying, all I want you to do is for me to go through, and when I see goats that are speckled or spotted, and I see sheep that are black, I want those. But the second thing he wanted was all of the future goats that were going to be born speckled or spotted, and all of the sheep that were going to be born black. So if any of the sheep are born black, those are going to be my future sheep. And if any of the goats are born speckled or they're born with spots, they're going to be mine. Now, it's important for you to understand, because it sounds like, oh my, this isn't a good deal for Laban. But it's important to understand that in the Middle East, sheep are generally white and goats are usually solid black or brown. It's the exception for goats to be speckled or spotted and for sheep to be black. In fact, black sheep were so rare and speckled ones, goats, were so rare that normally they brought just a higher price. It's something that you wanted. But you need to understand that they were very rare. So Laban agreed. And once again, he thought he'd pulled one over on Jacob. Look at verse number 34. All right, Laban replied, it will be as you say. And he jumped on it immediately. Now, to show you what kind of a person that Laban really was, right off the bat, he broke the agreement with a technicality. Fine print, lawyer, look at verses 35 and 36. But that very day, Laban went out and removed the male goats that were streaked and spotted, all the female goats that were speckled and spotted or had white patches, and all the black sheep. He placed them in the care of his own sons, who took them a 3 days' journey from where Jacob was. Meanwhile, Jacob stayed. He honored his agreement, and he cared for the rest of Laban's flock. Now, technically, Laban never said he wouldn't inspect the flocks first and remove the spotted and speckled goats or black sheep. In fact, the only agreement that he and Jacob had was that Jacob could inspect the flocks that day and remove any speckled or spotted goats that he saw and any black sheep that he saw as his wages. But if they were removed before he inspected them, well, too bad. I never agreed that I wouldn't do it first. And the implication is, once he made this agreement, he actually had some type of diversion to keep Jacob busy while he and his sons were able to go out there and start going through the flock and getting all the speckled and spotted goats and all of the black sheep and getting them out of the herds, out of the flocks, and putting them in his son's flocks. And the first thing he tells them is, get them out of here. I want them to be 3 days away. Now, that's where he really took it to the extreme. He actually had his sons take their flocks a 3 days journey away from Jacob. And the reason he did that is because he didn't want the speckled and the spotted goats and the black sheep to be breeding with the flocks that Jacob was taking care of at the watering holes. So the whole purpose of getting them away a 3 days journey is so that they would be at a different watering hole. Man, he was trying to put all of the things in his favor. He was stacking the deck, and he was doing a pretty good job about it. But even though Laban once again is dealing treacherously with Jacob, maybe he is doing something that's not technically wrong, because here's the fine print. He really is undermining and breaching the contract on a gentleman's agreement. But here's what's interesting. That's okay. Because Jacob is smarter than Laban, and God's on his side. And so even though Laban has dealt treacherously, it's very interesting. Jacob still honors the agreement, and he doesn't freak out. Now later on, because he understands what he did and why he did it and how he did it and what his intentions were, later on when he's ready to leave, he's fed up with Laban, because no one wants to deal with a person that's like that. Right? But here's what's interesting. He still honors the agreement. And it's not just because he has this mighty faith in God. That's part of it. But it's also because Jacob knows something that others don't, and it's because of God-given wisdom, which we're going to find out in a little bit. Look at verses 37 through 43. Now, as we read this, I want you to keep in mind, all of the spotted goats, all of the speckled goats, they've been culled from the herd. Anyone that has a white patch, they've been taken off. All of the black sheep are gone. So the only thing that Jacob has is this, I guess you would say, single-colored animals. That's all he has. So let's read what he does, verses 37 through 43. Jacob, however, took fresh-cut branches from poplar, almond, and plane trees and made white stripes on them by peeling the bark and exposing the white inner wood of the branches. Then he placed the peeled branches in all the watering troughs so that they would be directly in front of the flocks when they came to drink. When the flocks were in heat and came to drink, they made it in front of the branches. And they bore young that were streaked or speckled or spotted. Jacob set apart the young of the flock by themselves, but made the rest face the streaked and dark-colored animals that belonged to Laban. Thus he made separate flocks for himself and did not put them with Laban's animals. Whenever the stronger females were in heat, Jacob would place the branches in the troughs in front of the animals so they would mate near the branches. But if the animals were weak, he would not place them there. So the weak animals went to Laban and the strong ones to Jacob. In this way, the man grew exceedingly prosperous and came to own large flocks and female and male servants and camels and donkeys. Now, I have to be honest with you. For years, I studied this and I thought, what? How in the world did he do that? And what was the purpose of stripping the bark off of these 3 different types of trees, the branches from these trees, putting them in the watering troughs? What made them do that? And I would read all of these different articles and commentaries and what different scholars thought. It's like, none of that makes sense. But if you tear this apart, this is something, especially at a time when everyone was superstitious and really didn't understand selective breeding. So let me kind of go through this and show you what Jacob did. And this is why Jacob didn't freak out when all of the speckled and spotted goats and all of the black sheep were culled out of the herds, all right, or flocks. Now, the first thing that Jacob did was he separated the best and the strongest animals from those that were weaker, and he made 2 flocks out of them. Now, the reason we don't understand that it's the first thing that he did is because it's not mentioned until verses 41 and 42. But you need to understand something, especially with biblical literature. Not always is everything put in the exact order. Sometimes things are put in a certain order because it's emphasizing something, but it's not in chronological order. And that can really throw us off. So most of the time, we don't understand that the first thing that he did was he separated the best and the strongest animals from all the other animals that weren't as strong and weren't as good. So he actually had two flocks. He had this one flock that were the best, the strongest, and then he had this other flock that was like, okay, you didn't make the cut. That's the rest of them. Now, does anyone understand why he would do that? Brilliant. It's because the best and the strongest goats, and also sheep, are usually hybrids. In other words, mixed breeds. And even though they were solid in color, they carried the recessive genes for spottedness and speckledness. Now, why did they carry the recessive genes? Because they were hybrids. They were mixed breeds. And when Jacob bred two animals with the same recessive genes, it produced speckled and spotted goats. How many of you remember studying Mendelian Genetics? Do you remember doing that in high school, and then you're in college and you're going through all that, and you really don't care about it except just learn the information to be able to pass the test. So you memorized all the charts, so if they put the chart on there, you didn't understand why it happened, but it happened this way, and you could predict what would take place. Well, basically, before we even knew this, because really the one who actually did all this experimenting was a guy by the name of Gregor Mendel, and that's why we call it Mendelian Genetics. He was an Austrian monk, and he was a botanist, and he took flowers, and he would do all these crosses with them, and he produced all of these different things. And, you can do the same thing with animals. They did it for years without even realizing it. They knew what they were doing. They didn't know why it worked that way. But here's what's interesting. When he separated these two flocks, usually your strongest and your best animals are hybrids. They're ones that's been bred. They've been crossbred, mixed. You're getting the best from all of this. But the interesting thing about them is they have the recessive genes. So now you mix them where they all have the recessive genes. So guess what's going to take place? You're basically, because they don't have this, they have those genes, they're going to produce animals that are spotted and speckled. And so that's actually what he was doing. But then he took it a step further. He also kept the weaker animals from breeding with the stronger. So not only was he getting spotted and speckled offspring, but they were also stronger than others. So what took place is Laban's got weaker and weaker, and his got stronger and stronger. And here's Laban coming out to inspect, because remember, Jacob told him he can. You can come in and inspect my herds. And if I have any of my herds, or any of my flocks, if I have any of mine that are not speckled or spotted, you'll know that I've stolen. But it didn't mean, even as he was getting these spotted and speckled ones here, he was still keeping, now he's got 3 flocks. He's got the strong ones of the same color, and they're the best, but he knows they're hybrids. He's got his that are spotted and speckled, and they're the strong ones, and then he's got the bad ones over here. So he will still let these begin to breed this way, and he's still breeding these, and he's getting more and more, and they're getting stronger and stronger. Look at verses 41 and 42. Whenever the stronger females were ready to mate, Jacob would place the peeled branches in the rotting troughs in front of them. Then they would mate in front of the branches. But he didn't do this with the weaker ones. So the weaker lambs belonged to Laban, and the stronger ones were Jacob's. So Jacob had the best goats, and everyone knew that. He had the best sheep, and everyone knew that. So guess what he was able to do with that? He was able to sell them, trade them for other things. Look at verse number 43. As a result, Jacob became very wealthy with large flocks of sheep and goats, females and male servants, and many camels and donkeys. So Jacob got rich by trading his better and stronger animals for servants, camels, and donkeys. And he's so good at this selective breeding that in 6 years, he's going to be a wealthy man going home. And of course, we're going to understand why Laban and his sons are so upset. But that's not all that he did. In fact, we skipped over verses and got to the main thing, the thing that he did first. Let's look at what else he did and why he did it. Look at verses 37 through 39 again. Then Jacob took some fresh branches from poplar, almond, and plane trees and peeled off strips of bark, making white streaks on them. Then he placed these peeled branches in the watering troughs where the flocks came to drink, for that was where they mated. And when they made it in front of the white streaked branches, they gave birth to young that were streaked, speckled, and spotted. Now remember, if you don't take this in context with what I told you that he did first, it's the strong ones. He gives us clarification in the later verses that we've already read. It was only the strong ones that did that. The weak ones did it. Now, there's an old wives' tale, a superstition, that says if an animal happened to be looking at something striped at the time they were mating, they would produce striped offspring. Or if they were looking at something spotted while they mated, they would produce spotted offspring. But people, that's just an old wives' tale. That's superstition. It's not true. So a lot of scholars think that Jacob was superstitious and that's why he did it, but that's not true. Let me tell you why he did that. First of all, it kept Laban and his sons from figuring out how he was using selective breeding. I told you he was going to use his intellect. That's why he didn't freak out. I'll be honest with you. We're going to get to this, and, well, I'll get ahead of myself. I don't want to do that. But Jacob, for 14 years, had did nothing but these herds. And he was a hard worker. And before he left for Haran, he wasn't like Esau, his brother. He learned the family business. And what was the family business? Raising livestock. He understood selective breeding. So he was up on this. But the interesting thing about it is, it kept Laban and his, by him putting these three different types of branches in there, and with this superstition that when they look at that, if they look at that while they're copulating, then they're going to produce striped and speckled and spotted offspring. And so Laban and his sons, they're looking at this, and they thought that the reason his herd was growing is because he was doing that, and that's not unfair. They can't tell him not to do that. But really, it was because they were superstitious, not Jacob. But he was using their superstition to keep them from learning what he was doing. It's kind of like if they think I'm doing this, that's what they concentrate on. So they're right in front of their eyes. I can do what's really causing it. Is everyone with me? Let's go a little bit further. The second reason he did it is because each type of the branch that he used puts out a toxic substance. But when you combine all three of those toxic substances together in small amounts, it actually hastens the estrus cycle in animals. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, it heightens the female's readiness to copulate. It made them go into heat, and they were more excited. In fact, one of the things that they'll do when these things are taken is you'll actually see the female goats mounting the male goats, and that's the signal that, yep, we're ready to go. And that's why he was doing that. But he was only doing it with the best ones. Now, where in the world did Jacob learn this? Two places. The first place was home. As I told you, while Esau was running around and hunting and fishing and refusing to learn the family business, Jacob was a man of the tents. He was a plain man. That is not what that word plain means. Remember what it means. It means he was a righteous man. He was a just man. He did what a good son would do, and he learned the family business. And the family business was raising livestock. So he probably learned that these three types of branches produced a toxic substance, and when diluted with water, it wasn't poisonous enough, but it would hasten this estrus cycle. It would create this within them. And the second place he learned this was God. And this is where it really gets good. You see, Jacob had a dream, and he doesn't tell us when he had the dream. We just know that he had the dream when he was at Laban's and working for Laban. It might have been in the first 14 years, and this is how he developed this plan. So when he said, this is what I want, he already knew how it worked and what would happen, and he already knew Laban's character. And so when Laban did what he did, it was like no big deal. I got it covered. But we don't know when. It might have been during the 6 years, but it would have had to have been at the beginning of this first 6 years in order to learn this. But Laban had a dream, and in the dream, God showed him what to do. Let's jump ahead and let's read Genesis 31, verses 10 through 11. One time during the mating season, now he's telling this to his wives, He's telling them that we need to leave. Your dad's upset. Your brothers are upset. I can't help it that God blesses me. And I'm sure he added, and that they're stupid and I'm smart. But anyways, he's telling them why he has to leave. And so part of this is he tells them this dream. He said, one time during the mating season, I had a dream. And I saw that the male goats mating with the females were streaked, speckled, and spotted. Then in my dream, the angel of God said to me, Jacob. And I replied, yes, here I am. The angel said, look up and you will see that only the streaked, speckled, and spotted males are mating with the females of your flock. For I have seen how Laban has treated you. Now, if you noticed, God had to tell Jacob what he was seeing. Why? Because what he saw in the dream wasn't possible. What he saw was spotted and speckled males vigorously mating. In fact, in the Hebrew, it means vigorously mating. How do I say it any better? But they were vigorously mating. I mean, it's almost to the point where you got to beat them off with the females. But he didn't have any speckled or spotted males. Why? Well, again, that's really a rarity in the Middle East, but also because Laban had culled them out. And especially if this dream happened early on in the 6 years, it's because he didn't have any. But what God was showing him was that the stronger dominant males, the ones who had the recessive genes, were the stronger ones, were the vigorous ones, were the ones you almost had to beat off, the ones that ran off the weaker ones. And even though they weren't spotted or speckled on the outside, on the inside, they were. And the light bulb goes off. Oh my gosh. You're showing me where I see these spotted and these speckled goats, they're vigorously mating with the strong females. But God, I don't have any spotted or speckled. And God says, what do you see? Well, I see spotted and speckled. He says, what you see is spotted and speckled. And light bulb goes off. I don't have any spotted and speckled on the outside. But on the inside, it's the strong, vigorous, best animals. And they wouldn't have called it recessive genes because they didn't know what that was. So Jacob didn't know anything about Mendelian genetics. He just knew that God had showed him that he was to breed the best and the strongest animals with each other. And that's why he separated. The very first thing he did was the flocks into two groups. Only the best, only the strongest made it in the first flocks. All the others went the other way. Very interesting. So what he was doing was employing selective breeding. Now, again, as I said, we don't know when he received this dream. It might have been shortly before the 6-year period that he worked for Laban, or it might have been during it. But somewhere down the line, God showed him that. Now, of course, you know what the story is. Eventually, Jacob becomes so wealthy that Laban and his sons, he's got to be doing something wrong. So it creates friction. It creates animosity. And Jacob understands, we got to go or it's going to get bad. And he pulls his wives aside. Of course, that's next week.